Hello, welcome again to Energy 101. This time we're joined again by Professor Elizabeth Wilson, who will be talking to us about electricity, what electricity grids are, how they work, and how that's changing. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Hey, Megan, how are you?
Good, thank you. All right, so let's get started talking about electricity. So first, can you tell us what electricity is and where it actually comes from?
Right. I mean, a lot of people think about electricity coming like oil or gas from someplace, but really we make electricity and we can make it from all kinds of different sources. One of the slides that I really like to show when we're thinking about how we think about the electricity system in relationship to other forms of energy are some slides put together by Lawrence Livermore National Labs. And they have these really wonderful kind of energy Sankey diagrams, these energy flow diagrams that show all of the different sources of energy. This is the US energy system in 2020, which was a year that we actually used a lot less energy because of COVID. So you can see energy coming from solar resources, nuclear resources, hydropower, wind, geothermal, natural gas, coal. You can even make electricity from biomass or oil, although in the US that's not too common. And then when you think about electricity and what it's used for, it's easy for people to think about it in our homes in the residential sector, but you can also think about it in businesses or the industrial sector, not so much in transportation now. And I just want to point about, that there's energy that's actually used and useful, and then there's waste. That's energy that's lost in transformation from one resource to another. That's energy lost in transmission across the grid, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the electricity system fits right in the middle. And different sources are used to make electricity, and then electricity feeds into our different energy services, powering, for example, our refrigerators or different industrial processes. And maybe in the future, more in the transportation sector too, although as I mentioned before, today that's pretty small, although it gets a lot of attention. Point that I think is interesting here is when you look at the wasted energy coming out of electricity, just recognizing that a lot of the power we generate doesn't actually go just through I know you wanted to ask about the second law of thermodynamics, but this idea of the first law of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics governing how much energy is actually made into electricity depends on different physical processes and different technologies as well. The question of how do electricity grids work? Traditionally, we had centralized electricity generators, like a big coal plant or a big nuclear plant or a big natural gas plant. And that was connected through high voltage transmission systems and then stepped down through substations. While some industrial customers would be getting energy right there from the high voltage system, for most people, there was a step down to the distribution network. And that's what most people have going to their houses or to their businesses, or the lower voltage distribution networks that cover our town. And so while originally grids and electricity provision grew up from municipal generators covering their cities, over time, grids have been connected to provide more reliability. Electricity really is one of those just-in-time services. And so when you need electricity, electricity is kind of immediately supplied. So generation of electricity always varied with demand. So when we're thinking about electricity demand, demand varies. It varies in the time of day when everyone wakes up and turns on their coffee pots or their tea kettles and takes their showers. And then we used to go to work, and then as you are working, you're using energy there, and then people will come home in the evening, make dinner, turn on lights, play computer games, and then go to bed. And so there's a kind of a daily pattern. And there's also a pattern that varies across seasons. There's patterns that vary there. So traditionally, electricity demand governed what generation would look like and when plants were running. And so recognizing that demand can also be managed is a technological approach called demand management that says that we can shift some of our activities sometimes and actually change the shapes of these demand curves. That becomes really interesting and important when we have more variable resources like wind or solar on our system that have to be managed in different ways. And so if you're able to have a flexible demand, you end up with more possibilities for having larger percentages of renewables on the system. And so if you took all of those hours of the year and kind of stacked them up, you'll have a few hours of the year where you'll have a lot of power needed, and then an average kind of number, and then a few hours of the year where you don't actually use much power. And traditionally, you would have plants that were kind of base load plants that would run all the time. You'd have other plants that were shoulder plants that would run kind of in that middle. And then you'd also have the peaker plants, those plants that would run sometimes just for a few hours in the year. Now, all that's changing. And you're having dispatching of electricity plants shifting based on market algorithms, based on the cost, relative cost vis-a-vis other resources, relative cost of fuels. So this is a really interesting time that the electricity system is being put together in new configurations and new ways. One of your other questions was, are grids the same everywhere? And within North America, we have the Eastern interconnection and the Western interconnection, and actually Texas is its own grid. So one of the areas that I end up studying a little bit are regional transmission organizations, which are within the Eastern interconnection and the Western interconnection, and are organizations that manage transmission planning, they manage market operations, and they'll manage also, to a large extent, reliability within those organizations. Within the RTOs, as they're called, you also have states with their public utility commissions who are in charge of rate structuring and some industrial policies. And you also have utilities. Some utilities active in many states, others just locally. Some utilities are transmission dependent, meaning they don't own their own generation assets. They're only providing distribution level resources to their customers. And so there's lots of different configurations within regional transmission organizations, within the Eastern and Western interconnect, and within how electricity is managed across the country. You also see really different grid assets in different parts of the country, where some parts of the country are more dependent still on coal, and others natural gas, others have a lot more renewables on their system. And so that heterogeneity, those differences across systems, really, you can see it in state politics, you can see it in kind of vulnerabilities to different types of disruption and different types of supply.
Great. I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question to that, which was a great explanation of how our grids are connected in the United States. Is there an easy way to tell us how that's maybe different in other parts of the world?
Yeah, United States, we're connected actually as kind of North America. Europe also has coordinated markets across the European region. In other parts of the world, it's handled very differently, oftentimes more with smaller national companies going forward there too. China, which has one of the largest grids, has a couple of different grid operators who are managing things, and those remain state-owned enterprises.
Thank you. So you mentioned that in different parts of the United States, some places are more dependent on, still very, very dependent on fossil fuels. Some places are starting to generate their electricity more from renewable sources. So what are some of the challenges associated with our electricity use and electricity grids, and how does that tie in to the transition to sustainable energy?
When we're thinking about changing the energy system, oftentimes we think just about technologies or just about different options. But when I talked before about it being kind of multi-jurisdictional, appreciating that there are federal actors involved as well as state actors, there's big consumer groups, and then there are, of course, the courts that are involved in many of the different decisions there, and also civil society stakeholders, both as energy consumers, we're paying for electricity in our own systems, but also as voters in our states and in our country. So I appreciate that how you change an energy system really is something that is beyond a single technology. It's beyond a single decision, and it really is this kind of multiple different players with very different interests coming together to allow different types of changes on the system to happen. And so when you're thinking about having more renewables on the system, you're thinking not only about building individual projects, connecting them to the grid, having agreements that allow for a tariff to be earned on those projects and the energy to be moved through a transmission system to different customer bases. You're also thinking about how the grid rules are changing to allow for variable resources to be incorporated into the grid. You're thinking about how the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will be thinking about the reliability standards that are passed on by the National Electricity Reliability Commission. And so it really is a host of players coming together. And when you're thinking about residential solar, which I know a lot of us do on rooftops or in home areas, it's a really different proposition than a large scale wind farm. But at the same time, many of the decisions in terms of allowing grid reliability standards and incorporating with existing infrastructure remain the same. And so I appreciate that this transition is one that involves a lot of different people at a lot of different places. And in some places, it's gotten a little bit easier. In other places, it remains quite hard. And what I have enjoyed about studying this for the last couple decades is just how much has happened that we previously assumed was impossible. So one of the pieces that I think is really challenging going forward is we're talking about transitioning the energy system to reduce fewer greenhouse gases while also making it more resilient to this very different, challenging and changing climate that we're moving into. And I just want to recognize that none of our legacy energy systems were designed, built, or are operated for these extreme weather conditions, meaning the more frequent hurricanes, the floods, the droughts. And we're already seeing our energy systems really shaken up by a lot of the climate damage and weather-related damages over the past years. And so as we are thinking about being more dependent on electricity, having the simultaneous conversation about ensuring resilience in our systems is also really important. And I appreciate the distributed energy and the conversation of resilience in our grids is happening at local levels, it's happening at state levels, and also federally.
All right, thank you. Is there anything that you want to add about electricity grids before we finish up?
I have appreciated living in more rural areas of the country, how a lot of the decisions and policies in terms of electrification of the transportation sector really look different here. We don't necessarily have the parallel infrastructures like good cell phone service that allow for easy public charging infrastructures to work seamlessly. It's really hard to use a public charging site if your cell phone doesn't have access. And so thinking about what electrification of some critical sectors means for rural areas, I think brings a whole host of other conversations that are really important for us to have. One piece that I also think about in terms of resilience is how critical infrastructures like education, like healthcare, are going to be supported also. And so that's an area of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management. What is the A for?
Is it Administration Association?
Administration. The Federal Emergency Management Administration is really spending a lot of time thinking about how, when you have a weather-related disaster, are you able to ensure that vital energy services are there to help people stay alive? I mean, when Hurricane Ida hit New Orleans, it wasn't the storm that killed people, it was the heat afterwards and the fact that people couldn't keep themselves cool. And so really thinking about our energy system as part of the lifeblood of our societies and ensuring that with these weather-related disruptions, we're able to keep people alive is very, very important.
All right, thank you again to Professor Elizabeth Wilson for joining us today. And next up in Energy 101, we'll welcome back Irving Institute Senior Advisor Stephen Doig, as he's going to dig a little deeper into the complex challenge of managing and transforming our transportation systems.